everybody. Welcome to Fast and Loose, my knitting podcast. This is episode 4. If you've watched previous episodes, you know that it didn't used to be called Fast and Loose. It was called Stephanie Earp's Knitting Podcast. I always hoped that I would come up with like a more catchy name, and over the last couple of weeks, this is what I've come up with, Fast and Loose. I really like it. And I'll tell you what the origin is. I don't know, like way back in university, I wrote an essay about Sylvia Plath for a women's writers course that I was taking, and I got it back, and I didn't get the super greatest grade on it. And on it, the prof had written, "You're playing fast and loose with the essay format." But then, much to my surprise, considering my crappy grade and that comment, she nominated it for a prize for best creative use of creative language in a university essay. So there were mixed messages, but I think also I didn't fully understand fast and loose as a phrase. I didn't take it as a negative necessarily. I sort of congratulated myself on that. I was like, yeah, I am fast and loose. But I mean, officially, it kind of means cheating. I don't think she was accusing me of cheating on the essay. But I guess it did ring true for me that sort of my approach to all things is get enthusiastic, dive in, go fast, don't necessarily pay attention to all of the rules, and see what happens. And often what happens is you have mistakes when you work that way, and then you have to go back and fix them later, which if you had just invested the time at the beginning, maybe you wouldn't have had to do. Anyways, it seems that this approach it certainly has followed me through my whole life and continues into my new work that I've been doing the last year as a designer of knitting patterns. So I'm trying to embrace the fast and loose a little bit. That's why I'm calling the podcast that. But I'm also trying to think about ways that I can do better. So I'll talk to you a little bit about that as I talk about the two patterns that are sort of the feature of this episode. And why the fast and loose thing sort of came to me. So I'm kind of breaking with my tradition of looking at an older pattern this episode, and I'm going to talk about my two Peregrina patterns, the La Peregrina, which is an adult sweater, and the Little Peregrina, which is a kid sweater. So the origins of this sweater is that I think back when I had published Galore, Monica from Yarn Experiments, who's an indie dyer, had reached out to me and said, hey, if you ever want yarn for a design, I'd love to work with you, which is obviously amazing and flattering and incredible. Oh, that's my neighbors going up their stairs. I'll let them go by before I continue. Okay. Anyways, obviously her work's really beautiful, and the colorway that I settled on was called Mexico City, and we talked about sort of what weight we were interested in, and we both felt like sport weight is having a moment. So I got some sport weight in Mexico City from her and started trying to design. And originally I had pitched her sort of this very complicated cardigan with lapels and a strange sort of massive increase around the shoulders, and I still really liked that idea, but it really wasn't possible to grade it out to other sizes. So I found myself sort of sitting, we were up at the cottage in Quebec, in northern Quebec. I had my yarn and my needles, and I started trying to design a little bit on the needles, and using a similar kind of increase borrowed from Estonian knitting, I came up with the yoke for the La Peregrina, which you see here. So from there, it was pretty, once the yoke was done, it sort of designed itself. It's got long columns of knit stitches against a ground of reverse stockinette, which continues on the sleeves. And then just for fun, I also added the little lace pattern from the yoke back onto the sleeve cuff, just for a little interesting detail. And I went for sort of more of a cropped fit with this. It's not super cropped, but it definitely hits sort of just above the hip bones. And the sleeves are actually maybe a little bit on the shorter side too, like more towards a little bit above the wrist bone, which I thought was like a delicate fit, which fit with the yoke. But certainly it would be a really easy adjustment to add length to the body, or add a little bit of length to the sleeve, because obviously once you're past the yoke, you're into some pretty easy knitting. So I designed this yoke pretty much, like I said, on the needles as I was going, and I was really happy with the way it worked out, but it meant that I wasn't really taking notes exactly. Like I had some scribbled notes in my I don't know, workbook or whatever, but I didn't have like a chart. So when it came time to write this pattern up, I thought, oh, I definitely need to put a chart in. And I even bought Stitch Mastery, which is a computer software program for doing charts, and did it all up. And it really only once I was into the editing process with my technical editor did I realize that this yoke chart was a little bit complicated, because inside this lace pattern here, which I'll try and show you a little bit more close up, there are some double decreases. So it's the actual stitch is slip one, knit two together, and then pass the slip stitch over. So it's a 3-stitch decrease of double decrease. And because of the way I've structured the yoke, that happens over the end of round mark here in the back. This one. So while it makes perfect sense as you're knitting it what happens, to explain it either written out or especially in a chart form is complicated, because you have to move your beginning or end of round marker to make room for this. And so there's in a couple of rounds you move it over to the left, and then when you're sort of finished doing this you move it back over to the right, and that was really difficult to express in a chart. But boy, did I ever keep going and push forward. And I really thought, because I had knitted a number of times, because I did the adult version and I was working on the kids version, and I had to do some ripping for the sizing. I really thought, I have knit this enough times, I'm sure about these instructions, I'm sure they're right. So went to tech editing. I definitely got asked by my tech editor about the chart because it was unusual, and we made some changes to it. But in the end, a tech editor doesn't knit your pattern, they just read it through, and it's sort of up to me as the designer to be sure that the instructions are correct. And they weren't. So I had published it, and people had started to buy it, and a couple of days in, I was working away on the child's version and really had this realization of like, oh, this chart does not work. So I went back to the drawing. I made some quick changes myself and did an update, fast and loose, right? Didn't check with anyone else, just was like, oh, I can fix this, and did it. And then continuing to work away on my child's version, realized, oh no, I've actually broken it. I've made it worse. So trying to learn from my mistakes a little bit, I was like, okay, instead of immediately going out and doing another update on this, I need to go back to my tech editor and I need help. So I cast on the yoke again, this time using a DK weight just so it would be faster, and got in touch with my tech editor, who brought in another tech editor. So now it's like it's been tech edited. There's now like a second tech editor working on it. We're all like knitting away furiously, reading furiously, trying to figure out how to fix it. And lots of great suggestions, but in the end, what I came up with is I took the yoke chart out. I went back to just written instructions for the yoke, and I feel much more confident with that. And that update has now been made, and everybody who's bought it has gotten their update. But for the kids version, that's what I did as well. So at that point, I was still working on getting the kids version going. So the upshot is the pattern is right, the pattern is out, but there is no yoke chart. So as a knitter, if you're heavy on charts, you might find this, a little frustrating to have like 42 rows of written instructions. But it is quite repetitive, and it's a lot of fun to work. But yeah, so I think the lesson for me is like I've been trying to skip steps maybe a little bit, because what happens for me is I get so excited about something I'm working on, and I just want to get it out in the world. And I've done some tests, like test knitting, where you have your sort of draft pattern and you ask for some volunteers to knit it if they want to, and that's like a thread on Ravelry where you're sort of like, hey, does anyone want to check out this pattern and knit it for me? And what they get out of it is a chance to sort of preview a new pattern, and then often you offer like a little extra for them. But the only problem with that process, of course, it adds a lot of time. Like, people are not going to commit to knitting your pattern in a week. You got to give, for a whole sweater, at least 6 weeks is really the only thing that's fair, because they have to figure out what yarn they're going to have, and if maybe they need to order it, and they have other projects on the go. And I was like, I don't want to do it. I've been working on this since the summer. I just want to get it out. I'm sure that me knitting it all these times is going to be enough. And it really wasn't. So this experience has definitely taught me that I need to slow down. So not be quite so fast. take the time with the patterns and look for test knitters and make sure to take time to incorporate their feedback. And, I'm hopeful that I'm not sending them patterns with errors, but there's more information that you can get from tech knitters, like test knitters. Is it easy to understand? Is there any complications with difficulty in the knitting? Like one of the things that came up was Sweet Vicious. It was fine and the pattern was correct, but like yarn management was a bit of an issue with things getting tangled, things like that. So it's all really helpful information to know. But it means sort of slowing down. So my next pattern probably won't be out until the end of October because it's in test knitting, and I'm really excited. I have a nice large group of test knitters testing almost every single size. So I feel like I'm setting myself up to not have this sort of panic happen again. Here's hoping. Yeah, and just also looking at other parts of my process as a designer for ways that I can make sure that I'm not passing any errors on to my knitters, the people who take the time to and invest their money in my patterns and want to make a beautiful thing. The last thing I want to do is give them a headache and give them any heartache. And so it's a little bit of like having to control elements of my own personality. Like I still think like my enthusiasm and my speed and the way that I dive into things are assets, but I'm going to have to learn how to balance them if I'm going to continue in this line of work and learn when to put the brakes on. I can be a little impulsive. So anyways, moving on, I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about the design elements of the sweater and what's going to happen if you decide to knit it. So I mentioned that I was working on this up at the cottage, so I didn't have my full kit with me. I had some of my interchangeable needles and I had some cords, but not everything. And so I did knit a gauge swatch. I did know what I was going for, but what happened was I cast on the neck here, and my cord on my needles was a little bit long for what I needed. Like I think I was looking for 22 inches at the neck and my cord was a 24. So I did that thing, which I'm sure you guys, anyone who's knitting around has experienced this thing, where just for the first couple of rounds, I was like really pushing it to get it around my 24 inches. And as a result, the neckline got kind of very stretched out compared to what I was expecting. But I really liked the effect, and I didn't want to change it back. I loved it. So if you buy the pattern, you'll see that there's a note about the gauge for the neckline, that you need to do a really loose cast on, and that the gauge garter is like 3.75 stitches per inch, versus the rest of the sweater is like 6 stitches per inch, which granted is in stockinette. But you really got to make sure if you want the neckline to fit. It's particularly important with the kids version that you're getting that gauge at the top here in some of the garter. So if you need to go up a needle size, go up 2 needle sizes, do what you got to do to get that. Otherwise, you're going to have a completely different neckline. And for me, obviously, that means next time I do something like that, maybe try to actually swatch it out without using the extra long cord and see how that goes. But for me, I do find that garter is so stretchy compared to other stitch patterns that for me I didn't have to change needles to get that effect, but you might need to. So after you cast on the neck, there's some back some short row shaping in the back neck on the adult version. Here, I'll lean this forward. Okay. So you can see that this is a slightly higher. It's in reverse stockinette. It's higher here than it is in the front, and that's worked with short rows. I use German short rows, and I do have a link to a tutorial on how to do that. And it's a really good technique to have under your belt for another element of this sweater. So you come down and you work the yoke, and the increases here are at the beginning of these sort of heart shapes, leaf shapes here. And the increase is borrowed from Estonian knitting. So it's actually that you put your needle into 2 stitches, and then you create 5 from that. So you knit, you yarn over, you knit, you yarn over, you knit, and you create 5. I first ran into these kinds of increases when I knit Laminaria from Knitty years ago, and I just love the way it sort of is like an explosion of stitches. There's this thing really, really beautiful about it, and it creates these sort of rounded shapes. So that's how the increases in the yoke are made. And then after that, you are really knitting mostly in reverse stockinette, so purl side out, with these columns of knits that come down through the sleeves as well. So listen, I like purling. I'm like into it. I don't have an issue with doing a lot of purling, but even I, after knitting this so many times, was like, okay, I need a break from all this purling. And I've often seen instructions and patterns about, oh, you could knit this inside out. But what I didn't really understand was, how do you start right side out like this? Because you're working this lace panel. You don't want to be trying to figure out how to do that on the wrong side. And then get to sort of where the arms split, or even before that, and say, okay, well, now I want to work in the other way. So I was fussing around with that, trying to come up with a way that was somewhat invisible. And I did. I used a German short row. So basically what I did is, after I finished the yoke and had gotten a couple rounds beyond my my lace, I did a German short row right here on the back, at the back stitch, the center back. So I just basically switched directions and started knitting the other way, and was able to do mostly stockinette with little purl ridges instead of the other way. And so I made a little video tutorial about that, and it's linked in the pattern, but I'll also add it to the end of this podcast if you want to stay tuned at the end and check that out. I did the same thing on the sleeves, which actually, no, I did the same thing on the sleeves by working the sleeve inside out most of the time, and then when it was time to do this little sleeve cuff detail, the little lace detail, I did the same thing. I switched around so that I was back on the right side, and you work a few rows before you start your ribbing. So on the ribbing, I do have you go down a needle size, but I still, like, to me, it's not designed to be super pulled in. It's just a little bit of a nice finish. And for me, I find my favorite cast off for that is to knit two together through the back loop, put the needle, the stitch back on the left needle, and do it again. But you may find binding off in rib is better for you. Yeah. Oh, and the one other thing is, in some of the sizes, I think it happens more in the kids' sizes. There's only one size in the adult where this happens. Is that sort of where you put this sleeve lace? I say to do it at the center stitch, so at the top of your arm. But the truth is, when you wear it, the top of your arm one kind of sits a little bit towards the back. And in some of the sizes, the way that the yoke splits, it's actually not centered. It would be either a little bit to the back or a little bit to the front. So in the pattern, I sort of say you decide where you want it. For me, I think in those sizes, I would prefer to put it a little bit more towards the front, so that when you wear it, it would sit more right on the back of your wrist. So yeah, that's the La Peregrina. So this is knit in a sport weight at a gauge of 24 stitches per over 10 centimeters, 4 inches. You could probably get that with a fingering weight as well, a heavier fingering. So I was thinking about like Julia Asselin Fino maybe, or Artfil Bell. All of those would be good possibilities. I would say swatch, swatch, swatch. But yeah, I think that could work. So meanwhile, I also decided, since it was so cute, that I would do a little kids version as well. So this is for a 4-year-old, and the pattern pictures are modeled by my daughter. I had to bribe her with a lot of chocolate to get that done. And the only difference here is that the neckline is different. Because of the way that this is constructed with these huge increases, as you go down sizes, the neck was getting increasingly smaller and smaller and smaller. So, and there wasn't a lot I could do to change that without completely rewriting the yoke increases. So what I did instead is, instead of doing short row shaping in the back neck for the kids sizes, I actually did it so that you work flat for the first few rows, and you do like a keyhole neckline here. So you work these initial 8 rounds of garter stitch flat, and then the first increase you also work flat, and you join to work in the round after that. So I added a little button and a little crochet loop so that I could close it. And here's a tip: if you're sure and you know what button you're going to use before you even cast on, you can actually, and you use a shank button. Like a shank button is one where it just has the one sort of thing. It's not holes in the top, but is got a shank at the back. So if you use one of those, you can actually thread that onto your yarn and knit it into place on like the second row of your sweater. And then you don't have to worry about sewing it later, although you may have to sort of firm it up, but it won't fall off because it's knit into place. So with the kids versions, I did go ahead and do some decreases in the sleeves. And so it's a little bit slim fitting, I would say, for a little one. Like at the size 2 and the size 4, I was sort of like debating whether I would put any sleeve decreases at all. But I was looking at some of my daughter's stuff, and there are, the sleeves do fit, come in fitted more to the cuff, so I went for it. And certainly it fits my daughter just fine. But then the other possibility, if you are thinking, oh, well, I'd like it to have more flexibility, would be to just don't do any decreases, and then do like a double cuff, like double the ribbing, and then you could fold it up when it's short, like when you need it short, and then let it go when you need it long. So I think until September 30th, I have a deal running where if you buy the adult version of the pattern, you get the Little Peregrina for 50% off. So you can get both for in the $11 range. And if you want to do some twinning with your kid, you could do that. I'm definitely looking forward to doing that with mine. You know, I'm weird like that. I think that would be fun. And like I said, both these samples were knit in Yarn Experiments Sport Monkey 80/20, so that's 80% merino, 20% nylon, but she does have also a 100% merino base. Yarn Experiments in the colorway Mexico City, which is this lovely bluish gray with speckles. But then the other color she has that I just love is called Dirty Ballerina. I considered that one. It's really gorgeous. So there you go. That is the Little Peregrina and the La Peregrina. And despite all the heartache, I have to say, I really love this, and I've worn it a few times since all the drama, and it's comfortable, because it's got some nice ease through here. Like, even though I don't tend to add a lot of ease to my patterns, I tend to like things kind of on measurement or maybe an inch beyond. It's because it's got a little bit of a lower yoke. There's some nice room here, that is a really nice fit. And yeah, it's just like perfect for this time of year where it's not freezing cold yet, but you're still ready to wear a sweater. So I mentioned gauge and my swatching and then my neck and all this stuff. So, and it's something I hear about a lot from people. Like when people have bought one of my patterns and they're writing to me with questions, it's often about gauge. And it's not just that, but even when I'm in communication with my tech editor, often the questions are about gauge. So I thought I would talk about that a little bit and illuminate what happens on my end, for how I decide what gauge to tell you the pattern is at, and sort of the difficulties that go into trying to ask you to duplicate it. So here's how I work. So I'll have an idea for a pattern and I sketch it out, and I'll do a little gauge swatch, and often that swatch is not a square. It's weird. It's like I start by maybe casting on the rib, and then I start doing some increases to see what kind of increase might I want to use, and then I'll do some decreases. Maybe I throw a cable in there or a lace pattern. So the thing that I've got at the end is kind of a mess. But once I've sort of settled on what it is that I'm going to do in the sweater, then I'll add a bunch of stockinette at the end and measure that for my gauge. But this is big. We're talking about something like this big, maybe this big. I'll block it, and I measure it, and I use that to do the rough numbers, the math, for my sample size. And either at the same time, sometimes at the same time, start grading. Other times I do my grading after I'm finished. But I don't really use that gauge, like the gauge from that swatch, to write the gauge in the pattern. What I do is I finish the garment, I block it, sometimes I wear it, and then I measure the gauge, not on a 10 centimeter square, but across the entire sweater. So, when I'm measuring the gauge for this, I'm actually lying it flat. I know how many stitches are in it because I designed it and I knit it. I measure across flat and say, okay, so if that's 18 inches and I know that I passed on 250 stitches, and half of 250, I have 125 over 18 inches, and that's how I calculate my gauge and the gauge that I write down for you to follow, because it's the most accurate. So at the end of the pattern, you have a schematic that has some measurements on it that tells you, oh, it's this much at the bust, it's this much at the sleeves, this is how long they are. And that's something that my tech editor would check quite heavily. So she's going to go, well, you say the gauge is 6 stitches per inch, but when I see the bust, it doesn't make sense. So that's often where I'll go back and remeasure this, because the measurements are sitting there in front of me. I know it's 36 inches, but if the gauge I've given you doesn't come out to 36, then I've made a mistake in the gauge. All this to say, the gauge I'm telling you to get is coming from the ultimate large swatch that has been washed and worn and sat on a mannequin and maybe been ironed a couple of times so that I can see my stitch patterns. It's very different than a 10 by 10 square that you're going to make up to say, okay, this yarn and these needles are going to work for this pattern. How to solve that? I'm not sure that you can. I mean, consider the source. I did just call my podcast Fast and Loose, and I'm telling you that I skip steps sometimes. But I guess increasingly, I'm not sure. I mean, gauge is important. You need to know gauge to know fit. But are you ever really going to be able to replicate someone else's gauge? I mean, yes, I guess. I mean, it's happened to me occasionally. Once or twice I've managed to actually get gauge. But most of the time there is some variation between what I'm producing in my fabric and what a pattern calls for. And nothing short of making the entire garment really is going to give me that information. I think part of what I find frustrating about gauge or how to talk about it is, you know, it's like we try to approach it sometimes with this like almost mechanical machine approach of like, well, you have to get 26 stitches over 10 centimeters and these many rows. But chances are from row to row, from stitch to stitch, there's variation. So where you measure in your swatch, so you might sometimes have 6 stitches, you might have 6.5, you might have 6.25, somewhere else you have 7. So, you know, when I do a whole sweater, what you're getting is an average of those little minor variations. But when you're looking at your little 10 by 10, there's not enough variation within that swatch for you to get the same information. I think of it a little bit like there's a scene in 6 Feet Under ages ago where like Claire goes to art college and she has to draw a perfect circle. It's like I'm telling you, you need to draw a perfect circle and you need to draw it freehand. Your 2 hands with no mechanical assistance, and the only things that you're allowed to give yourself to help you do this is, you know, you can look at some perfect 2-inch circles, and maybe you can put some dots in a piece of paper, and you could like maybe use a ruler to separate those dots. But in the end, what I really need you to do is take your hand, put it on the paper, and draw a perfect circle with no mechanical aid. You can get close, but you probably are. You're never going to get a perfect circle without machine intervention. So I think that's kind of a way to think about gauge. Your gauge swatch is going to give you valuable information about whether you've chosen the right needles and the right yarn, whether you're going to be able to produce the right fit. But I think it's really useful as a knitter, if you're interested in working from knitting patterns, to learn how to make small adjustments based on your gauge information. For example, I was talking to someone in the store at Espace Tricot who was knitting Caitlin Hunter's Birkin, and her gauge was off by like a stitch over an inch, right? So instead of having 7 stitches per inch or 5 stitches, she had 6, right? So it seems small, but over the course of an entire sweater, it's a lot. So we did a little trick that I've seen actually. Andrea on Fruity Knitting has talked about this recently, and it definitely is a good one to know, is to say, okay, here's the gauge I'm getting. I'm not talking about your little swatch. I'm talking about now you're knitting the sweater and you're into like a full yoke, and you do a gauge measurement and you're like, I'm supposed to have 7 stitches per inch, but I have 6. Great, you have 6 stitches per inch. You know some information. The next piece of information you know is what size you would probably like this sweater to be, say around the bust. And say you know you want it to be 40 inches. So multiply 40 by 6, and that number, go find in the pattern the stitch count that's sort of here in that area, and look for the size that's closest to what you're going to get. And that's the size instructions to follow, sort of. Obviously that has to do with stitch counts. And then there's length. So your row gauge is going to be different. So let's say based on this information, you're 40 inches and you're 6 stitches. It looks like you should be knitting the XL, but in fact you know that you mostly wear a medium. What you need to do then is follow the stitch instructions for that XL, but the length measurements for your medium. So if it says, you know, to knit your sleeve 15 inches long in the medium and 17 inches long in the XL, that 15 is for you. This is going to present some challenges when it comes to sleeve increases and decreases that are timed out over a certain length. If you're working on a raglan sweater, it's going to present issues. So you're going to need to learn some math and start thinking about how those things can work. Now, granted, this is not what we're hoping for as designers. We're really trying very hard to give you all the information you need to be able to make it from the instructions. But I just think it's worth thinking about because I do think gauge is tough. It's there as it's like 90% accurate, but there's that 10% that can really, that's hard to predict. And especially as a looser knitter, I'm trying very hard to use those use test knitting to get a better sense of whether my gauge is is sort of an average gauge or whether it's really loose. I've noticed recently that my gauges seems to be getting tighter as I'm knitting more and more. I'm getting better at sort of regulating my gauge. So a little tidbit on gauge that always helps me, it's a bit counterintuitive, but especially like if I'm in the store helping with somebody, bigger equals smaller, smaller equals bigger as a rule with gauge. So let's say you have 6 stitches per inch, but you need 7, so you need a bigger gauge, then you need to go to a smaller needle. And if your gauge is too small, like you have 7 stitches and in an inch and you need 6, then you're going to go to a bigger needle. So if you want smaller, go bigger. If you want bigger, go smaller. Yeah, there you go. A little mnemonic to help you out. Speaking of gauge and fast and loose and skipping steps, my old knit today is the Cordova pattern by Michele Wang. This was part of the Brooklyn Tweed capsule collection that she did a few years ago. And I think I finished this up sometime in 2015. I knitted in Briggs & Little 2-ply that I bought in a tiny sort of general store in Newfoundland inside the Grossmorn National Park. So the yarn is definitely precious to me. It was one of those things where I saw a picture of it and was like, I need to knit that right now. Take me to a yarn store. And thankfully, even in this middle of nowhere place that I was staying with friends, there was one available. So I think in my notes on this on Ravelry, I'm a little bit unnecessarily harsh, but I found this pattern was sort of like, I thought, overwritten. Like there was an awful lot of sort of very technique heavy directions. For example, it asked for a tubular cast on for all of the various sections. So the front and back and the sleeves. And then I thought, well, I don't need a tubular cast on. I've never needed one of those. I'll just cast on regularly. I'm sure it'll be fine. And when I finished sort of this, I realized, no, it's definitely not fine. It flares out really badly. So on the sleeves, I did do the tubular cast on. So it's a little, they don't do the flare as badly. But yeah, I just had all these sort of like, it's 11 pages long. It's like, how can a boxy sweater be 11 pages long? But that is sort of Brooklyn Tweed's deal, and I have more appreciation for it now that I'm writing patterns sometimes 11 pages long myself, although not usually. Most of my stuff is like 6 to 7 pages max. But this is a case where I played fast and loose. You know, I didn't use the cast on that was asked for. I didn't really check my gauge properly. And as a result, the sweater was really big. Now, part of that is because I was about 6 months postpartum when I cast it on, but by the time I finished it, I was closer to like 16 months postpartum, and I'd lost some weight, so I hadn't chosen necessarily the right size. So how to solve it? It was way too big. What could I do about it? So it's a pretty feltable wool. So I just machine sewed new seams in the sleeves and in the body, and I just cut like 2 inches out of it. It's not perfect, but it's wearable. I mean, it's definitely a very weekendy kind of fit. I think also I did something funny here, like where the neckline is not quite correct. It doesn't sit exactly evenly. Like I think my pickup in the neck, I didn't space it evenly. Again, like one of those things I was like, this won't matter. No one will be able to tell, but you can. So I guess just again thinking about my fast and loose attitude that I could change it. I could be more particular, and I might get better results. There you go. So that's the Cordova by Michele Wang. It is a really beautiful piece. I think part of why this thing does flare is that the difference here between these 3 cable patterns here, like that is definitely a very different gauge than here where I use seed stitch, which in fact is not what she calls for. She calls for a Trinity stitch, and I used a seed stitch. So again, like who am I to say that the pattern is the problem when I didn't follow the directions? I'm just a giant jerk. Anyway, okay, so on my needles, I have a cal going on, a knit along going on right now on my Galore sweater, and at the moment I'm in danger of not meeting my own deadline. It's terrible. It's October 12th is when I set for finished objects to be entered to win a prize, and here's mine so far. This is knit in Tanis Fiber Arts Pure Wash worsted, DK, sorry, in 5 colors. And I have just added my 5th color, which is called Lightning. It's a purple with some little specks of orange that I realize increases like a stormy sky. And those little flecks of yellowy orange are the lightning. It's so cool. But I'm definitely, I'm seeing it very color blocked, like much more so than the other 4 colors that I used. So I'm curious how it's going to look when I'm finished. I'm probably about, I don't know, a couple inches away from taking out the 4th color and working the last few rows with just lightning, which will be quite purple. I do love it. I love the colors. I love the effect. I did the lower neckline modification that I talked about on one of my blog posts, where I cast on the number of stitches for after the first increase. And I still haven't tried it on because I haven't finished the body and I'm too lazy to take it off the needles and try it on. So here's hoping it's going to work. But there you go. So that's my goal, is to get this body cast off this weekend and then get going on the sleeves and hopefully have it in time for Rhinebeck, because I'm going to Rhinebeck this year. I'm really excited. It's going to be my first time. And yeah, I'm looking forward to like walking around the fairgrounds in my Galore and see if people want to talk about it. And I'm excited to see everybody else's sweaters. And then the other thing that's on my nails is an upcoming design. And so a while ago at Espastico, we did a La Bien-Aimée pop-up, this beautiful yarn dyed in Paris that can be a little bit hard to get here in Canada. And it was nuts. We sold like 800 skeins of yarn in 24 hours. And I grabbed 3. And my colors were Undergrowth, which is sort of a silvery, browny gold. It looks to me very metallic, like metal-y tones, but earthy. My second color was called Victorian Mauve, very purple. You know I love my purple, but it's got some brown undertones as well. And my third color that I bought is called Rose Quartz, and so it's sort of a speckly neutral, very pretty, lots of pinks and purples in it. With just 3 skeins, I thought, I guess I originally thought maybe I would do some kind of shawl, but I think I'm not a shawl knitter, let's admit it. It's not really my bag. I really wanted to do a garment. So this design definitely was one of those things where like I woke up one day and was like, oh, I know what I'm going to do. It's still very much in progress. I probably shouldn't show it, but I can't help it. I'm just so happy with it. So it's sort of a fade through 3 colors. There's some lace detail. There's a really interesting stitch pattern on the body here. I'm not going to show too much detail because obviously I want to finish it up and then be able to show you guys something, a finished item that's ready for publication. But I'm really enjoying working with this gorgeous yarn, and so to give you an idea of like what is an easy pattern, a success, like the first time out, which this was, I've only had to reknit the sleeve 1 time. Like I knit the whole sleeve down to the cuff once and was like, no, I want to tweak it, I want to change this, and that. And the second time it worked great. So now I'm working on sleeve number 2, and I don't think I'll be making any further changes to the actual design. I'm just making some decisions about the finishing of the neckline and the hemline. So hopefully maybe this will also get finished this weekend. I know that's a lot of knitting time. I don't know if that's actually going to be possible. God, I got to finish this podcast, get to work, get knitting. And that of course will also go into a tech editing test process and a tech editing process. So I'm not sure when this will be kind of available to you. Maybe November if I get my act together. And then after that, I have another idea that I've been sitting on for a bit, waiting for some yarn support from the wonderful Julie Asselin. I have the yarn now in my possession. I just have to get going on casting on and starting my grading process for that. So I think it's going to be a really busy fall for me, and really excited and looking forward to everything. But since it's a little bit quiet right now, I have obviously the 2 Peregrinas are up, but I don't have anything coming for a while. I thought, let's do a little sale. So I'm going to do like a BOGO, buy one, get one, to the end of the month, let's say, to the end of September. If you buy any one of my patterns in my Ravelry store, let's make it 2018 patterns. Any of my 2018 published patterns in my Ravelry store, you can get one for free with the code. I should really come up with these codes before I start filming. Like, I mean, lesson, fast and loose. Oh, let's do that. We'll go with loose, LOOSE. That'll be the code. And you can buy any one pattern and get a second one for free. Unfortunately, I'm not going to do this with past purchases. So hopefully it'll drive some of you to try some new stuff from me if you've liked something in the past. Give it a shot. Everything's been updated. All the mistakes are gone. Oh God. I think. And of course, if you do find any errors, if you have any problems, I'm more than happy to help with pattern support, obviously with fixing any mistakes, which I hope there aren't any anymore. But yeah, you can contact me through Ravelry. You can contact me through my website at stephanieearp.com. There's a contact form there. Sometimes people write to me through Instagram on the like the direct messages. I don't love that because it really is something I only use on my phone, and then it means that I don't have the ability to like double check my stuff on my desktop computer. If that's really your only way to reach out to me, that's cool, but maybe I'll ask you for an email address if it's going to require more back and forth. And yeah, I think that's everything. So there you go. Fast and Loose, episode 4. BOGO sale with the code LOOSE. La Peregrina and Little Peregrina also till September 30th, available on a deal. No code needed if you've bought this pattern already. If you buy it now, the other one comes at 50% off. Just put them both in your cart and you'll see the discount. And that's only on Ravelry because they make it really easy to offer these kinds of promotions. Okay, that's it from me. I hopefully will see you guys again soon with new patterns, new old knits, and more tips. So stay tuned for the little tutorial on changing directions in the round, and I'll see you guys soon. Thanks for watching. Bye. Hi, this is Stephanie Earp, and this is a little tutorial for switching from knitting right side out to knitting inside out in the round. So I'm not sure if this is something that everybody already knows and I'm figuring it out, or if it really is something sort of innovative that I've come up with. But either way, I thought I would share it because even if it is well known, I didn't see a lot on YouTube or anywhere else when I went looking for it. So you'll see a lot of stuff about working inside out, but I was looking for something where I could work the yoke of my La Peregrina sweater, which is this lovely lace stuff. I wanted to work that right side out, like as it was, the chart is written. But now that I've completed the yoke and I've separated from my sleeves, I would like to switch to working this side, which is mostly knitting with one purl ridge versus the other way around. So this is what I did when I was making my adult version. I'm now working on the kids version. So once I was finished sort of all my important right side work, I was coming up to the end of my round, which as you can see, there's a lot of purling to do, hence the name, La Peregrina, named for a famous pearl. So I'll try to be really steady here. I'm purling across to the end of my round, which happens to end with a knit stitch, which is kind of convenient for what I'm about to do. So I finished my round. You can see that's my end of round marker. I'll knit this stitch, and now I'm going to turn my work, and I'm going to do a German short row. So to do a German short row, I keep my yarn in front. I slip the stitch back, just worked back to my right-hand needle, and I kind of pull the yarn up and over to reveal these two legs of the stitch. Position my yarn for my next stitch, keeping the tension. Get that out of the way. Keeping the tension, and I knit. So now as you can see, I've switched directions. I'm now knitting in the other direction, just as you would with a short row, but I'm not going to do a short row. I'm going to knit all the way around my round. So hang on while I do that, and then I'll show you how I resolve the stitch. Okay, so I've now knit all the way around back to my marker inside out. And as you can see, I'm going to come on back to my marker. I'm trying to keep this very steady and not too fast. And you can see a little bit, I mean, I find German short rows can be tough to see, that I have a double stitch here on my purl. So to resolve it, I'm just going to insert my needle into both legs of the stitch and purl them together. And then I can continue around. I'll do a few stitches and I'll show you what it looks like on the other side. So as you can see on this side, it is pretty much invisible. To really prove that to you, I'd have to knit another round, but I can tell you that it was invisible on my adult La Peregrina, and I also used this on the sleeves twice because I basically switched to knit them inside out after sort of knitting them the right side in for a little while. I guess I only did it on one. The second one I just knit inside out. But when I came to the lace detail, if you go look at the pattern, I switched again to be working right side out again. So there you go. You can use a short row to switch directions on your knitting. If you use a German short row, if you use a wrap and turn, if you use a Japanese short row, whatever your technique, your preferred technique is, I think all of them would work. Obviously, you want to select something that looks good when you resolve it, kind of coming at it from the other side, which I find German short rows are really good for. And then you can go ahead and knit the rest of this pattern, the body of this sweater, working primarily knit stitches. So especially if you're an English knitter, that's a really nice thing to have. And you can apply this technique to any pattern, yoke pattern, for example, where you'd want to switch directions and do a purl ground or a reverse stockinette ground, but not have to knit all those purl stitches. All right, thanks for tuning in, and check out my patterns on Ravelry. This one's called La Peregrina. Thanks, bye.